Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Really glad you could join us today. I'm genuinely excited about where we're headed because, well, we're tackling something that might just shake up how you view power, freedom, and your own place in the world. Okay, let's unpack this. Today, our mission is to get into the, let's say, provocative thinking of an author named Rose. We're mainly going to be pulling from his book with that really striking title, The Tyrant's Blueprint, How Freedom is Lost. But we'll also connect it to some of his other stuff, like The Most Dangerous Superstition, and that, frankly, quite disturbing book, How to Be a Successful Tyrant. So the goal here, for you listening, is pretty clear. We want to pull out the really critical, sometimes maybe unsettling bits of insight from these works. And this isn't just theory, right? It's about understanding the actual mechanics, how power is grabbed, how it's held on to, and maybe the key part, how our own freedom can just sort of slip away, often without us really noticing. We're going to touch on the psychology behind why people might go along with it, the real livers of control.
It should definitely make you look at power dynamics a bit differently. Okay, so to really get how freedom might be lost, we first need to understand the person who spent, well, decades looking at how it erodes. Rose isn't just writing books. He's almost like a forensic analyst of power. He examines how control works with this, I don't know, chilling kind of precision. So who is this guy? And what's this single-minded mission that's got him trying to expose what he calls the myth of government authority? I mean, he's dedicated a huge chunk of his life, decades, to fighting this core belief in society. You look at titles like The Most Dangerous Superstition, The Iron Web, The Jones Plantation, even his big course, Candles in the Dark. You get the sense pretty quickly these aren't just, books or academic papers. They feel more like tools, right? Specifically designed to take apart these fundamental beliefs we might have about rulers and the systems they run. He really wants to shake up the very foundation of how we think about being governed. So, I mean, given how radical that sounds, what's the core argument he's making?
Well, yeah, the foundation of Rose's whole thing is this really, really radical claim. He says that the very belief in government authority, this sort of collective agreement we have that we need a ruling class, it primarily benefits people he bluntly calls sociopaths. Now, it's important to get what he means there. He's probably not using it like a strict clinical diagnosis.
Not like a psychiatrist would.
Exactly. It's more of a functional description. In his view, these are people driven by this relentless need for power. And crucially, they're not held back by conscience or empathy or any real moral compass. They see other people less as, well, people with rights and more as resources, things to be managed or manipulated for their own benefit.
Okay, so it's about a specific mindset focused only on power.
Yes. And his argument goes further. He suggests that this belief system, this widespread idea that we need to be ruled, it actually creates the perfect environment for these kinds of individuals to not just survive, but to actually climb to the top and gain, unchecked power. Think about it. If most people genuinely believe rulers are necessary or legitimate, maybe even acting in their best interest, well, that opens up a huge opportunity, doesn't it?
A kind of vacuum.
A vacuum, or maybe like fertile ground, yeah, for people who are the opposite of benevolent. If you don't have ethical concerns, the chance to control vast resources, direct populations through laws, shape the public story, that's incredibly appealing. Rose basically argues the system doesn't just attract these types, it actively empowers them. It gives them legal cover and lets them flourish.
That's a really stark claim, calling political leaders sociopaths, even in that functional sense. Does he talk about how they justify it to themselves? Or is it just that morality isn't even part of their calculation, like the ends always justify the means for them?
That's a really key point. And Rose would likely say that for these specific individuals, morality, as most of us get it, it just doesn't factor into the power equation. Their justification is the power itself getting it, keeping it. The system, just by existing, gives them this appearance of legitimacy, right? So they don't really need a personal moral justification.
So being the legitimate ruler is justification enough.
Pretty much. If you're acting under the authority of the state, your actions are seen as lawful and often moral by default. And Rose kind of doubles down on this with what he calls his dark side thought experiment. He says, quite chillingly, that if he personally were to just toss out his own morals, his conscience, if he decided to embrace that power mindset, he could easily manipulate people into slavery.
Wow. That's intense.
It is, and he frames it not as some kind of boast, like he wants to be a dictator, but as a really stark way of showing how deeply he believes he understands the mechanics of control and human psychology. And to really drive this home, back in 2005, he actually wrote the satirical manual, How to Be a Successful Tyrant.
A satirical manual for tyranny. That sounds deeply uncomfortable.
It is. The whole idea is unsettling. It suggests the methods are so predictable, so effective, you could literally write a how-to guide. And he doesn't just talk broad strategy. He outlines specific psychological tactics, things like the managed crisis or the false flag, ways to shape how people see things, not by force, but by playing on fear and, our built-in biases. He shows how certain communication patterns can push people bit by bit towards censoring themselves and being willing to trade freedom for feeling safe. The satire is sharp. It exposes how awful these tactics are by just laying them bare.
What hits me about that manual, even if it's satire, is how many of those strategies he outlined way back then, especially using fear and crisis, seem to have, well, played out, like really played out in recent times. It makes it feel less like he was just guessing and more like he was spotting these fundamental patterns of how power works, patterns that maybe don't really care about which party is in charge or what the ideology is. It really forces you to look back at things differently, doesn't it? Absolutely does. It makes you face this uncomfortable idea that maybe Rose's work isn't just prediction. Maybe it's closer to an instruction manual for power consolidation. And this is where it gets really interesting, because his analysis isn't just abstract theory. It feels like he's describing stuff that's happening right now or just happened. He points to this general kind of chilling principle that tyrants, or anyone wanting more power, consistently use fear generated by crises to control people. And then he gives these examples that feel disturbingly familiar. Let's dive into some of those case studies he talks about.
Yeah, Rose definitely believes if you understand the playbook, you start seeing it everywhere. Let's kick off with COVID-19. He sees that as just a textbook example of a managed crisis. Years before it even happened, he apparently predicted that a government could use something like a virus, or even just an exaggerated disease scare, to grab huge amounts of power really quickly.
So not just a health crisis in his view.
Not just a health crisis. He saw it as a crisis that was expertly leveraged to centralize control. He'd point to how fast things went from 2 weeks to flatten the curve to, open-ended states of emergency. Suddenly, unelected officials and agencies had these sweeping new powers.
Right, the speed was incredible.
And the scope of what people accepted. Restrictions on travel, gathering, even making your own medical choices, things like mask mandates, vaccine passports. These were unthinkable just months before. Rose argues this wasn't just people being rational about a threat, it was psychological. He might call it something like voluntary servitude, pushed along by nonstop media focus on fear and government orders.
So the fear itself becomes the tool.
Exactly. Fear of this invisible enemy, this virus, created the perfect psychological space for people to willingly give up major freedoms, sometimes even demand the restrictions, all for safety. He sees it as this perfect storm, this fertile ground for pushing through measures that normally would have hit massive resistance, legally and publicly. And boom, the state's power and reach just expanded dramatically.
That is a really stark way to look back at something most of us live through as a genuine health emergency. His view really forces you to reconsider the timing and the scale of those government actions. If he's right, it suggests the crisis itself was maybe less important than the opportunity it created for power.
Precisely. And he argues this pattern isn't new at all. He looks at it across different historical situations. Take the war on drugs, for instance. He paints that as this self-feeding cycle built for control, not for actually solving anything. Now, most people get the basic economics. Prohibition creates black markets, right? You ban something people want, it doesn't disappear, it just goes underground.
Sure, basic supply and demand.
Right. But Rose flips that. He says governments aren't just failing to fix the black market problem, they're actually depending on it continuing. The chaos, the crime, the social problems that come with black markets, he sees that not as an unfortunate side effect, but as a deliberately maintained environment.
Maintained. Why?
Because that environment, being so problematic, gives them an endless, rock-solid reason to expand surveillance, boost police budgets, militarize police forces, and generally exert more control over people's lives. The laws themselves, he argues, aren't really about public welfare. They become direct tools of control. He'd point to things like asset forfeiture, where the government can take your stuff even without convicting you, or increased wiretapping, the massive growth of prisons.
Like a cycle that justifies itself.
Exactly. It's a self-licking ice cream cone, as they say, for accumulating power. The solution makes the problem worse, which then demands more solution, which means the original problem never gets solved because, well, it's just too useful for those who want more power.
Wow, so the very problem they say they're fighting is actually the excuse they need to keep growing their power. It's deeply cynical, but yeah, within his framework, it makes a kind of disturbing sense. Does he apply this logic to other threats, too?
Oh, absolutely. He sees it as a very flexible playbook. He brings up immigration scares as another prime example. He points out how politicians very effectively use fear of scary illegal aliens in structurally the exact same way they use, say, drug dealers or terrorists.
How so?
By framing an outside group as some kind of existential threat, maybe to jobs or security or culture, they can whip up public support for more state power very quickly and very effectively. This fear justifies huge spending on border security, new surveillance tech, more power for immigration agencies, even putting military-style operations on the border.
So it's about finding a scapegoat.
Essentially, yes. The specific scapegoat can change: immigrants today, terrorists yesterday, drug dealers before that, but the basic mechanism of control is identical. You unify people against this perceived common enemy, it distracts from problems at home, and it lets the state consolidate power by promising to protect everyone. It works because it taps into these really deep, primal fears and anxieties about us versus them. It makes people much more willing to accept limits on their own freedom if they think it keeps them safe from the other. In all these cases, Rose argues, the specific crisis or threat is almost beside the point. What really matters is the opportunity it gives rulers to expand their control.
That is a chilling consistency across such different issues. If these tactics are so reliable, it leads us to an even tougher question, doesn't it? About us, the public. How does Rose explain why people don't just put up with this, but seem to actively, participate in losing their own freedom? What's the psychology there? Why are these strategies so darn effective? Yeah, you really landed on what might be the most unsettling part of Rose's whole analysis. I mean, it's one thing to talk about leaders wanting control. It's quite another to confront this idea that people, often without maybe even realizing it, actively support the very things that take away their own rights. It feels completely backward, but Rose seems to suggest it happens all the time, almost predictably. We need to get into that psychology of complicity.
This is really where Rose digs into the core of how power sticks around and argues it's less about brute force and more about this cultivated, often unconscious agreement. His big assertion here is really profound. Tyrants, or any rulers looking to grow their power, they never actually want to solve the problem they're supposedly fighting. Doesn't matter if it's drugs, terrorism, disease, immigration.
They don't want to solve it. Why on earth not?
Because the problem isn't really a target for them to eliminate. It's a permanent, incredibly valuable excuse to tighten the screws. Just think about it logically from their perspective. If the war on drugs was actually won, if a disease was totally wiped out, if immigration stopped being framed as a threat, what happens then? Suddenly governments lose this huge, publicly accepted justification for massive agencies, giant budgets, sweeping surveillance powers, all that stuff.
The justification disappears.
Exactly. So for Rose, the continued existence, or at least the carefully managed perception of these problems, gives them an endless reason to intervene, to watch, to control. This totally flips how we might look at the stated goals of big government initiatives. It suggests the public reasons are often, maybe always, just a cover for the real goal, gathering more power.
That implies a level of, deliberate manipulation that feels hard to swallow for most people.
Yeah.
It's almost too cynical, right? If the problems are kept alive on purpose, how does he explain why the public buys into it? Why do they sometimes even cheer for the solutions these rulers offer?
Yeah, and that's where the role of propaganda becomes absolutely crucial and, as he describes it, insidious. Rose breaks down how propaganda isn't just about, say, spreading lies. It's about expertly shaping stories, crafting narratives, to convince the public to actively cheer for policies that actually diminish their own freedoms.
Like what kind of policies?
Well, think about things like widespread surveillance, random searches, seizing assets without a conviction, censoring dissenting views, putting military gear in the hands of local police.
Yeah, things that definitely limit individual liberty.
Hugely. Yet people are persuaded these things are not just necessary, but good. How? The propaganda taps into really powerful emotions. It convinces people these often harsh measures are for their safety. This creates this false sense of security. The threat feels so big, so immediate, that individual freedom starts to feel like a secondary issue, maybe even a bit selfish to worry about.
So safety trumps liberty in that emotional calculation.
Precisely. And the language is key. Authorities frame these actions as protective, keeping kids off drugs, protecting us from terrorists, fighting an invisible enemy. It's for the common good, never as restrictive. It's like a masterful psychological trade. You give up concrete freedoms for this vague promise of safety, and people become willing, even eager, participants in having their own options narrowed.
So it's not just fear, but this careful framing that makes restrictive things seem protective, even desirable. And that leads to what Rose sees as the ultimate act of complicity.
Exactly right. This brings us to Rose's bluntest, most uncomfortable claim about the ultimate complicity. He says, the people become complicit in their own enslavement by applauding authoritarian measures. That's really the core psychological insight he offers. Freedom isn't always taken by force, like soldiers kicking down doors. More often, he argues, it's given away, willingly, bit by bit, often unconsciously, driven by fear, ignorance, and this deeply cultivated but maybe false belief that we need this level of security.
The invisible chains.
Those invisible chains of belief and authority, yeah. He argues they're way stronger, way more effective than any actual chains or walls. These chains are mental, ideological. They're the assumptions we don't question, the things we're taught growing up, baked into society. They make people think rulers are just necessary, that their actions are okay just because they're official, and that trading liberty for security isn't just okay, it's the right thing to do. These chains aren't just ideas, you see them in action, like how people automatically defer to official titles or accept official stories without much question, or even how society pressures people to just go along with the group when there's a perceived threat. For you listening, maybe a takeaway here is to really pause and ask why someone is claiming authority, not just what they're claiming. Are they appealing to logic and evidence you can check? Or just to their title or some vague greater good? Rose's whole perspective totally reframes who's responsible. It's not just the rulers, it's also the ruled, and our beliefs. And this critical view, he applies it right up to the very top. He really doesn't hold back when talking about specific political leaders.
Absolutely. And his take on political figures is, yeah, pretty brutal. Rose doesn't seem to have any heroes in politics, does he? Left, right, center, doesn't matter. He seems to view them all as basically doing the same thing, keeping the state powerful no matter what slogans they use or what party they belong to. Okay, let's unpack this a bit. He definitely doesn't mince words.
No, he certainly does not. His analysis really slices through the usual party lines. He's focused squarely on their role in keeping state power going, or making it bigger. And yeah, his descriptions are pointed. It's important to see why he uses these labels, though. Like, he famously calls Donald Trump a pathetic, narcissistic puppet. He adds that Trump's clumsy propaganda still fooled millions.
Clumsy but effective. What's the point there?
Well, the implication isn't just an insult, it's a comment on how belief in authority works. Rose argues that even if the manipulation seems crude or, clumsy, it can still work incredibly well if people already have this deep-seated belief that they need a strong leader, that authority is legitimate. In Rose's view, Trump just tapped into existing fears, biases, desires for someone decisive. The polish, or lack thereof, didn't matter as much as the underlying willingness of people to believe. And ultimately, Rose would argue, Trump's actions serve to keep the state apparatus humming, maybe even expand it in some areas, executive orders, military spending, appeals to national power, and so on.
That's interesting. So the messenger's sophistication is less important than the audience's readiness to believe.
Yeah.
But he doesn't just single out Trump, right? He spreads the criticism around.
Oh, definitely not. He lumps together presidents from different times and parties, Biden, Obama, Bush, Clinton. He basically says they're equally guilty of perpetuating state power under different slogans.
Equally guilty. That erases a lot of political difference.
From his perspective, yes. This is key to his whole philosophy. It underlines his belief that the system itself, the belief that we need rulers, that the state as an institution is necessary, that's the real issue. Not just a specific person in charge or their party. The slogans change, hope and change, compassionate conservatism, build back better, whatever. But to Rose, that's just window dressing, marketing for different demographics.
So underneath the rhetoric.
Underneath, Rose argues, the machinery of state power just keeps grinding along, keeps growing, keeps digging in deeper. The fundamental job stays the same across all these administrations. Collect taxes, regulate, engage in military actions, expand surveillance, control the population. He'd point to things like the Patriot Act growing under both Bush and Obama, the national debt climbing under Democrats and Republicans alike, regulatory agencies expanding no matter who's in the White House.
That is a really bold claim, basically saying all modern presidents are functionally the same regarding state power. It definitely challenges how we normally think about political differences. And then there's his take on Reagan, which sounds even harsher.
Yeah, maybe the most cutting, and certainly one that raises eyebrows, is how he talks about Ronald Reagan. Rose calls him the most skillful con man in his lifetime.
Whoa, con man for Reagan. Why such a strong term, especially since many see him as championing freedom?
Exactly. That's why it's controversial. But Rose has a specific reason. He argues Reagan was brilliant at using pro-freedom rhetoric, talking about individual liberty, free markets, shrinking government, while at the same time, in practice, overseeing a massive expansion of government power.
How so?
Think about the huge jump in military spending during the Cold War buildup. Think about the major escalation of the war on drugs, which we already talked about as a tool of control in Rose's view. And the national debt ballooned under Reagan. For Rose, this is especially dangerous, or skillful in a cynical way, because it fools the very people who value freedom. They hear the words, they think they're supporting someone who will reduce the state's power, but the reality, he claims, is the opposite.
So the disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality is what makes him a con man in Rose's eyes.
Precisely. That paradox, the pro-freedom image, combined with significant state growth, makes Reagan, for Rose, a master manipulator, someone who could sell the idea of freedom while actually tightening the state's grip.
Okay, and then his view on communist dictators like Stalin and Mao, calling them incompetent, is jarring. Most would see them as brutally effective tyrants. How does Rose define competence differently here? Why focus on economic sustainability over just crushing people?
That's a great question because it gets right to the cold, maybe even utilitarian logic behind Rose's framework. So finally, he looks at communist dictators like Stalin and Mao, and yeah, he dismisses them, not for being less brutal. He fully acknowledges their horrific violence, but as incompetent tyrants. It seems counterintuitive, right? But the distinction is crucial for his argument. They're incompetent in his view, not because they weren't oppressive enough, they absolutely were, but because, as he puts it, they destroyed their own societies instead of exploiting them sustainably.
Destroyed instead of exploited.
Right.
Meaning,
Their regimes led to mass famine, total economic collapse, huge numbers of deaths. They essentially wrecked the very population they were trying to rule. From a purely cynical standpoint of maintaining power and extracting resources long-term, that's a terrible strategy. Rose sees destroying your society as short-sighted. An effective tyrant, in his unsettling view, wouldn't kill off the livestock. They'd keep them just healthy and productive enough to keep providing resources.
so their extreme brutality actually undermined their own long-term control and exploitation.
According to Rose, yes, it made sustainable exploitation impossible. Which leads directly to the next big question. If destroying society makes you incompetent, then what is the goal of a truly effective tyrant in Rose's framework? What are they actually trying to achieve?
That is a seriously chilling distinction, isn't it? Calling monsters like Stalin and Mao incompetent because they weren't efficient enough exploiters in the long run, it really forces the question, okay, if just crushing everyone isn't the mark of success, what is the end game for a truly effective authoritarian, according to Rose?
Yeah.
So what does this all mean? What's the master tyrant actually aiming for?
Right. And this is where Rose paints his most unsettling and frankly quite disturbing picture of the ideal tyrannical state from the tyrant's perspective, of course. The main goal, he argues, for the truly effective tyrant doesn't seek to crush people outright, but to exploit them while maintaining productivity. This is a huge shift from how we usually think of tyranny. You know, jackboots, overt oppression, constant visible fear.
So less about destruction, more about farming.
In a deeply disturbing way, yes. Ribs suggests that real tyrannical genius lies in sustainable extraction. It's a long-term game plan. Control designed to keep yielding benefits, maybe resources, labor, money, even ideas year after year. It's about getting the most out of the population without pushing them into open revolt or causing the whole system to collapse. A really successful tyrant knows that a controlled but reasonably functional population gives you more over time than a completely broken and starving one.
Okay, that makes a horrible kind of sense. And he uses an analogy to illustrate this.
He does, and it's powerful, and for many people, really deeply disturbing. It's the livestock analogy. He states it flat out. Like livestock on a farm, humans must remain healthy and producing wealth so rulers can siphon it off.
Wow. Reducing people to livestock.
Exactly. And breaking down what that implies is critical. It basically strips away all inherent human dignity, autonomy. People become resources, inputs in this big system that's managed solely for the ruler's benefit. So things like people's well-being, their education, healthcare, basic safety, anything that looks like the government is helping. Rose argues it's maintained only as long as it serves the ruler's interest in keeping the population productive.
Like a farmer feeding his cows.
Precisely. A farmer feeds and shelters his cows not out of kindness, but to make sure they produce milk or meat for his profit. An effective tyrant, in this view, allows just enough stability, maybe just enough opportunity and prosperity to keep people working, compliant, maybe reasonably content, but never enough for them to become truly independent, self-reliant, or powerful enough to challenge the whole setup. This connects back to policies that might seem good on the surface, social programs, infrastructure projects, but Rose sees them ultimately as ways to keep a docile, productive population that the state can keep taxing, keep using, keep controlling.
That analogy is incredibly unsettling because it reframes things we might see as positive government actions into something.
Yeah, far more insidious. It makes you reconsider all the subtle ways lives are managed. So if people are basically viewed as livestock in this model, how does the tyrant stop them from figuring it out? What's the key trick to keep this whole system running?
That really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it loops right back to those invisible chains we talked about, but maybe makes them even clearer. The absolute core of this sustainable exploitation, this whole control system, relies on what Rose calls the ultimate trick, maintaining the illusion of liberty, as he puts it. The trick is to keep people convinced they are free, while they're actually bound by invisible chains of belief and authority. It's presented as a psychological masterstroke.
So making people think they're free is more important than actually controlling their every move. In this model, yes. It's not about visible chains or prison bars for everyone. It's about shaping perception. It's about fostering a sense of contentment, maybe even resignation. And crucially, making sure that the basic belief that rulers are necessary, that they're legitimate, remains completely unchallenged. This illusion gets reinforced constantly, subtly, and overtly through media narratives, through education systems that teach deference to authority as normal, maybe even through entertainment that subtly reinforces bowing to power. If people believe they're free, if they think their choices are real and their government is basically legitimate, they're much, much less likely to fight back against their actual condition. They might complain about a specific law or a particular leader, sure, but they rarely question the fundamental idea of being ruled at all. What's fascinating here is just how subtle and deep these chains can become, like woven into the very fabric of how we live. It makes it incredibly hard for people to even see their own situation clearly, let alone try to change it. And this really leads us to Rose's final and quite urgent warning.
Yeah, that distinction is really something, the idea that the best tyranny is where you don't even know you're not free. It feels incredibly personal, especially when you remember Rose saying that if he went to the dark side, he could easily make people cheer for their own enslavement. That's not just him observing, it's him underlining how well he thinks he understands manipulation and how easily it could be used against all of us. So what's his final message then? Is there any hope in his view? What's he want us to take away?
Exactly. And despite how bleak or cynical some of this analysis might sound, his assessment of how easily people can be fooled, Rose's entire project, all his writing, seems driven by this really deep, almost desperate hope. His core purpose, the reason he makes all these controversial claims and does all this analysis, is, in his words, that by exposing these tactics, people will finally learn to start falling for them.
So it's fundamentally educational.
Absolutely. His critiques, the satirical guides, the more academic stuff, it's all part of this huge effort to educate people. He seems to genuinely believe that knowledge, especially self-awareness about how control and manipulation work, is the best, maybe the only, real defense against losing freedom. If you can spot the tricks, if you can identify the psychological buttons being pushed, the patterns of deception, then, he argues, you're much less likely to just go along with it unconsciously. It's like an urgent plea for radical critical thinking, for taking a really hard, honest look at reality, even the parts that make us uncomfortable. He's not really giving a roadmap for revolution. It feels more like a manual for liberating your own mind.
So the goal isn't necessarily about physically overthrowing governments, but maybe dismantling their legitimacy intellectually,
Right.
one person at a time. And this points to what he considers the real enemy.
Precisely. And that leads straight to Rose's most radical but also most fundamental bottom line. The true enemy, he says flat out, is not just politicians, but the belief that rulers are necessary or legitimate at all.
Wow, that shifts everything.
It totally reframes the whole debate, doesn't it? It stops being about swapping out a bad leader for a good one or changing parties. It becomes about questioning the basic, deeply ingrained assumption that any person or group has a right to rule over others. It challenges the whole structure of government as we know it, the very idea of the state. For Rose, the worst kind of slavery is the one you impose on yourself because you believe deep down that you need a master. It pushes us to ask if we, as individuals, have just handed over too much power simply by accepting the premise that somebody else has to be in charge. It moves way beyond everyday politics into the essence of how humans organize themselves and what individual freedom really means. It really asks us to look inside and ask ourselves, why do I believe I need someone to rule me? Hashtag tag outro.
Wow, okay. That was an intense deep dive into Rose's world. It's definitely a lot to chew on, and it kind of makes you want to re-examine, well, almost everything you thought you knew about power. So what does this all mean for us listening right now? We've walked through Rose's lifelong mission to challenge the myth of government authority. We've explored his really unsettling tyrant's blueprint, that guide to manipulation. We've seen how disturbingly his predictions about using fear in crisis pandemics, drug wars, you name it, seem to resonate with real-world events. We've had to confront that uncomfortable idea of psychological complicity, how fear and propaganda can lead people to actually support policies that limit their own freedom. We've heard his scathing views on political leaders, whether puppets or con men, all seen as ultimately serving the state. And we've graphed his chilling definition of an effective tyrant, not the one who destroys, but the one who farms humanity, keeping us productive under this carefully crafted illusion of liberty. I think the biggest takeaway for me is this idea that freedom isn't always lost in some big violent event. Often, it's more like a slow, quiet leak and erosion that happens bit by bit, fueled by our fears or unquestioned beliefs, and maybe a lack of paying close enough attention. It really is about those invisible chains we might not even feel.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, Rose's work really pushes us, doesn't it? It challenges us to look critically not just at what leaders do, but why we think we need them at all. How does that fundamental belief shape our reality? Shape what controls we're willing to accept? It's a radical nudge to question the whole architecture of power, and maybe more pointedly, our own role in holding it up. So here's something to mull over. If the most effective tyranny is the one where people think they're free while being farmed, what might be the first, maybe even a really small, everyday step you could take to genuinely test the edges of that perceived freedom in your own life? What tiny assumption about authority, something you normally just accept, could you start questioning today?
That is a powerful thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this very thought-provoking deep dive. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep exploring.